A father, a civilian, whose life was stripped from his hands. His life dripped from him in just 8 minutes. Imagine calling out for your mother in your last breaths. This is what George Floyd had to endure. As an African American woman who constantly faced discrimination for the color of my skin, I constantly fear for my brothers and my father as they go out into the world daily. Seeing George Floyd's execution did something to me. I saw my brothers and my father in that man. Racism is a subject that is uncomfortable to address, but not as nearly as uncomfortable as watching George Floyd's life taken from him, watching the news coverage of protesters across the nation who are fed up with racial discrimination. This case is imperative to American history and must be discussed in order for history to not attempt to repeat itself. In a few moments, I will cover the execution of George Floyd, the outrage that followed shortly after his passing, and the impact that it's had on America and how African Americans were treated in its aftermath. Let's start off with the first thing, George Floyd. There is public footage of George Floyd's killing, the 8-minute video. Floyd is seen struggling, laying down on his ground, on his front, while being handcuffed and pinned down by 3 police officers. One in particular had a knee pinned down on his neck. In the video, Floyd is repeatedly seen saying he cannot breathe and is struggling to breathe and is struggling to move. Bystanders watch in horror as they constantly see him yelling for his life. There was confusion amongst the crowd, trying to figure out why the officer continually had his knee placed on Floyd's neck as he was handcuffed. The crowd could be seen telling the officer to stop, but he did not cease to stop. Floyd was one of many African American men whose brutal deaths was captured on camera. According to the authors of the article, The Death of George Floyd, Floyd's death is the tip of another iceberg because these cases represent modern-day lynching. Floyd's execution was reported on camera with him stating, "I can't breathe." Similar to Eric Garner's killing, a man who was held in a chokehold for nearly 5 minutes, constantly saying, "I cannot breathe, I cannot breathe." At the time of his death, according to Samuel Amir of the Journal of the Human Behavior in the Social Environment, Amir states that in regards to protesters screaming the lines of both Garner and Floyd, this undermined what was meant to thrive. As millions across the world watched George Floyd's life slain in the public eye, outrage sparked and protests began to spread in a blink of an eye. The Black Lives Matter movement, which actually started with Trayvon Martin about 7 years ago, was established to provide clarity and peace for Black lives across the nation. According to Stephen Ahn of the article Bearing Witness, the protests began in the United States and spread further as far as Australia, Israel, Poland, Uganda, moving swiftly across racial, geographical, class, generational, and gender boundaries. People started to realize how hard it was for African Americans to live in America with daily discrimination. Protests were held and brought people from all across the nation to rejoice together as Black lives were being taken constantly across the nation. According to researchers Ruggs and Avery in the article, A Death in the Family, when things happening around us or to us, we are inclined to talk about them. Sometimes these conversations take place at work and involve participants of different races. It was important that the action was being held so that people can understand exactly what's going on. After George Floyd's death, as well as others in the same period, companies, schools, organizations, the world started to talk more about the Black race in America and how it became more prominent. Let's talk about the impact this had on Black culture. Companies like Amazon and Netflix started to pay homage to African Americans in the culture. Amazon started to highlight Black-owned sellers on the homepage and encourage people to buy from Black-owned businesses and support Black-owned business owners. For Netflix tended to highlight Black documentaries that was centered around oppression, systematic oppression at that, as well as equality for everyone across the nation. According to author Sarah Wiesman in the article, What Role Should Higher Education Play in Combating Racism?, states that a professor touched up upon the impact George Floyd's death had on schools, stating that we ought to talk about this more. Schools should have absolutely no reason why we are not talking about the deaths of Black lives across the nation. This was a lot to cover. How about we bring it back home? In conclusion, today I covered the death of George Floyd, the outrage that followed after, and the impact it had on our society in regards to how it affected African American people. George Floyd, a father, an unarmed Black man, was brutally killed. As a result, people were fed up and outraged from the racial injustice and demanded that repercussions were taken. It was gut-wrenching to see people, my people, like George Floyd, life be taken the way it was on camera. We learned about what transpired leading up to his death, the aftermath, and the protest that took place afterwards, the glimpse. But as we continue to educate ourselves as an industry, as history, the more we will continue to grow as a society.